Thank you. I understand today we have an interdisciplinary audience, and so I want to start the framing here kind of as broadly as possible in referring to kind of an obscure reference in the sociological literature. So insofar as there is a backbone to the sociological enterprise, you could say that what unites all of us is some general concern with inequality or stratification. Laumann and Center, almost 40 years ago now, argued that basically every bit of research on inequality and stratification will fit somewhere in this little 2x2 grid. In other words, you're either studying how positions in society are differentiated or how they're connected, right? And you either do so through an objective or a subjective lens. So for instance, with respect to the first quadrant, we can study how rewards or privileges are distributed throughout society, how much you make, how much access to, say, political power you have. Or you can also study the distribution of more subjective characteristics like honor or prestige. So as a sociologist, I don't make much money, I don't have much power, but maybe some of my students respect me a little bit at a stretch. On the right-hand side, and this is where we're going to focus today, we start to talk about networks, right? So you can ask who associates with whom on one hand, or who wants to associate with whom. Now, it's this final fourth quadrant that we're especially interested in. And some would argue that this really is the heart of sociology, the heart of inequality. It has to do with things like prejudice, our internal preferences and aversions, right? You could say symbolic boundaries. You could say, I would think most accurately, questions of subjective social distance. Who do we want to affiliate with? Who do we don't? How a given social structure looks like from the perspective of its inhabitants. Now, while important, this question is notoriously difficult to answer. You could say, well, look, let's just ask people about their prejudices, right? On the other hand, we of course know that people are not always aware of the attitudes that they have. If they are, they may not be willing to express them to a researcher in the first place. And even if they do, these preferences they express may not be generalizable to other circumstances. So an extremely common approach, instead of asking about these preferences directly, is to infer them from patterns of behavior. In other words, we view patterns in social networks as something of a barometer for intergroup relations. And in particular, there's a certain type of pattern and a certain type of preference we're interested in. That pattern is homogeneity, the tendency for similar people to be associated, and that preference is homophily, the preference to be affiliated with someone similar. Now, this terminological distinction is important. Homophily refers to a psychological construct, right? Do we actually want to be friends, to associate, to date someone similar to me versus the actual pattern? And I would say that actually about 99% of the research that is published under the heading of homophily actually has to do with homogeneity, right? Patterns in social networks. And you could argue that this pattern of homogeneity is one of the most ubiquitous, well-documented findings in all of sociology, right? The tendency of like to affiliate with like, birds of a feather to flock together. This pattern has been documented across a staggering array of circumstances, relationships, and also different types of attributes. And especially sociologists have been interested in documenting this pattern with respect to romantic ties, specifically operationalized as marriage ties, right? Because these data on marriage records are widely available. So again, it's difficult to overstate kind of the importance and the prominence of this body of work. Now, so far, only two important things to keep in mind that my talk is going to build on. The first one is, again, the importance and the prevalence of research on homogeneity, right? Super important. You all saw the reference to McPherson et al.'s paper in a couple slides ago, one of the most well-cited papers in all of sociology, right, about homophily and social networks. So the importance of research on homophily. And a lot of this work is premised on this often implicit assumption that by studying patterns, we can learn something about preferences. And it's exactly this inference that I want to draw into question today. And basically, I want to argue that so far, we actually know a great deal about segregation in social networks. We know surprisingly little about preferences and who people actually seek out in partners. This is for a number of reasons. Well, first, we know that patterns have multiple causes, right? One predictor of who we affiliate with is who we want to affiliate with, but there's also other factors. For instance, propinquity. Who we form ties with is inherently limited by who's available to meet in the first place. So even if you just form ties randomly, the distribution of characteristics in any given population is going to turn up in social networks. So if I were to just form friendships randomly with people in this room, I would turn up with a bunch of smart, good-looking, social scientists, right? Even if I'm not explicitly seeking such people out. So propinquity is an important determinant of these patterns. Second, we of course know that different social characteristics tend to be correlated. So apparent selection on one attribute may actually be a spurious consequence of selection on another attribute with which the first is correlated. Is Lauren here today? Lauren Rivera? No. I think she makes this point quite elegantly in her work on cultural matching and hiring. And this is especially important because many data sets on romantic ties in particular tend to have relatively sparse information about individuals, right? So this may mask homophily on other attributes we just haven't had data on before. Third, sociality may impact patterns of homogeneity. What I mean by this is the differential tendency of some people to form more ties with others. So in some prior work on Facebook data, my collaborator Andreas and I basically found that students of a mixed racial background tended to post and tag photos of other students from a mixed racial background, so mixed student homophily. It turned out, however, that students from a mixed racial background just tended to post and tag photos of everyone more often than the students from other backgrounds. So once you control for differential sociality, this tendency towards homophily effectively disappears. Finally, we can make a comparable argument on the other side of the spectrum, not who sends ties, but who's more likely to receive them. This is particularly problematic when you have data just on relationship outcomes. What I mean by that is, let's imagine, for instance, we have a population of heterosexual men and women who have either a graduate degree, an undergraduate degree, or a high school diploma. Now, if individuals at each of these levels actually prefer similarity, right, homophily is going on, of course we see a pattern of homogeneity in the data. On the other hand, let's say instead of similarity, everyone is seeking status. They compete with one another, right, for people with certain types of attributes. So what you get instead is the people on the top pair off, the people in the middle pair off, and the people on the bottom have no choice but to pair off as well. So you have an identical pattern of homogeneity that's generated by two entirely different underlying processes. All this is to say again is the first point is we know that homophily generates homogeneity, but there are a number of other mechanisms at work here as well, making that step of inference problematic. Second, well, patterns vary over time. What I mean by this is that longitudinal network data are still relatively uncommon, right? And when we do have longitudinal data, it tends to be about a specific type of relationship state, right? Friendships coming and going, marriages forming and dissolving. And when we do have comparative data, typically researchers have focused previously on relationships like dating and cohabitation and marriage. So while obviously social reality is dynamic and constantly evolving as relationships transition from one state to another, we often forget this when we analyze static network data. And we can imagine a number of different reasons, and researchers have speculated why preferences will be different under different circumstances. Maybe there's a quantitative difference, often called winnowing. In other words, maybe we have a preference for some attribute, it just gets stronger the closer the relationship. It could be a qualitative difference where we seek different things in different types of partners, right? Or perhaps basically no difference at all if you speculate that cohabitation is just an informal form of marriage. And working with longitudinal data, you also have other complications that arise. So it's not just the fact that people select on similarity. We all also become more similar to our friends and spouses and whatnot over time. And we also know that heterogeneous relationships of any kind are more likely to dissolve. Finally, there's some methodological limitations of this work, is that typically when we are comparing relationships of different states, these are still cross-sectional data, so we're comparing different people in different relationships, as opposed to watching, for instance, the same couple over time as that partnership transitions from different types of stages. Finally, preferences are constrained. We talked a bit earlier about how preferences are constrained by opportunities. What's less appreciated is the extent to which our preferences are constrained by A, our own actions, and B, by the actions of others. I think this was demonstrated wonderfully by a piece by Costness and Watts several years ago, and is implicit in a lot of contemporary sophisticated modeling approaches like the stochastic actor-based approach developed by Steglich and colleagues. But what it means in practice is this basic observation can have some far-reaching implications. So let's imagine I went out to a bar, for instance. I'm interested in romantic ties. And I documented basically just who approaches whom and asked for their phone number, right? And let's say somehow I have the data on the racial background of everyone. So let's imagine a population of Hispanic men, right? And I've looked out over the course of the night whom Hispanic men approached and asked for their numbers. And we see that they have a stronger tendency to ask for the phone numbers of other Hispanic women. They're getting numbers from everyone, right? But specifically asking, as indicated by the bolder arrow there, other Hispanic women for their phone numbers. So we have a clear case of racial homophily among Hispanic men. Okay? What we often forget is that there are other people that are part of this equation, other men who are also soliciting attention from Hispanic women. And in this scenario, let's imagine that for whatever reason, men from other racial backgrounds are even more interested in Hispanic women than are Hispanic men, right? And finally, let's imagine in this scenario that women have absolutely no racial preferences whatsoever. They just hand out to their phone number to whoever is asking, right? It'd be not unlike real life. It just may not be the right phone number, right? In other words, so we have perfect reciprocity in this system, so we can reciprocate all ties, actually give out the phone number to everyone who asks it. So what began as a case of very strong racial homophily among Hispanic men, combined with no homophily, in fact, total indifference among Hispanic women, actually ends up looking like a case of same-race aversion, right? Because of the complex interplay of these various types of forces. Again, factors that aren't typically recognized in analyses of relationship patterns. So this leaves us with an empirical puzzle, is that basically relationships are often treated as if they're expressions, right, of some inner preferences. What I want to argue instead, or point out, I believe, is that relationships are actually accumulations, right, not just of preferences, but an entire relationship history that came before any given snapshot we take. This opens up a number of different questions, such as what forces generate homogeneity, when exactly do these forces occur, and who is ultimately driving them. So the objective I want to pursue here is to actually isolate how much of observed homogeneity stems from direct A to B homophilous preference, right, as opposed to the pattern that we've been talking about so far. So in this talk then, what I'm going to do is while the majority of prior work on romantic relationships tends to focus on relationship outcomes, such as marriage, I'm going to shift attention to the opposite end of the relationship spectrum and instead focus on the initial screening and sorting processes whereby strangers consider other strangers as potential mates. This is what dating looks like, by the way. They express interest in some subset of this population and not others, and find that this interest is or is not reciprocated. So what this is doing is shifting attention to the earliest possible stages of relationship formation, not even relationship formation, but just a prerequisite to those relationships, right? Unless we do want to hang out in bars, it's not something we can typically observe. And as Skopek et al. Point out, it's important to note, of course, again, we're not studying actual relationships here, but these are prerequisites to the possibility of beginning a relationship in the first place, so the very earliest stages of romantic interaction. And to study this stage, I'm going to draw on data from a popular online dating site, which has, first of all, a number of different methodological advantages. We have a wide variety of personal attribute data that are available, anything people self-report on their profiles. We have the opportunity structure of all possible singles, in other words, anyone who's a member of the site at any given time. And we have directed dynamic data on user interaction. So this is a great example of what Golder and Macy call data on digital footprints, right? Massive in scale, but very, very detailed in the amount of information that's available about these interactions on this site. By the way, online dating is not just theoretically interesting and methodologically useful. It's also increasingly empirically common. So a recent study by Pew suggests that 11% of Americans and 38% of those single and looking have used online dating in some form or another. And as of 2010, the internet more broadly is the third most common way that heterosexual couples meet and the most common way that same-sex couples meet. Not just married couples, right, but any form of romantic relationship. So it's really kind of a historically unprecedented trend in how important online dating has become as a marriage market intermediary. So for the presumably 89% of you who haven't used online dating, I figured it's worthwhile to pause for a moment and just talk a bit about the data and what they look like. So my data come from a popular online dating site called OkCupid. Forgive me if the screenshot's a bit dated. This was taken when the data were collected, which is back in 2010. So the site may look a little bit differently for those of you who are using it at home today. You may have heard of OkCupid. It commonly comes up in discussions, maybe third after Match and eHarmony, right? One of their founders, Christian Rudder, also wrote a popular book, Dataclysm, that just came out. Important for our purposes is to know that it's a large site, right? It's a generalist site as opposed to the many niche dating sites that are out there that cater to individuals from a particular background or with certain interests. And also it's a free site. So on one hand, this eliminates a substantial barrier to entry and perhaps contributes to the generalizability of findings. On the other hand, you could argue that someone who's willing to join a free site may be less serious about finding their soulmate and therefore less representative. So some important cautionary notes to begin with. As we know, the first thing you do when you join any social network site is to create a personal profile. Here you pick a sexy screen name and a sexy photo that others are going to like. Okay, I was hoping to identify the sociologists in the audience there. you answer a bunch of personal prompts about yourself, right? Now, my data don't contain any identifiers whatsoever. I don't have pictures. I don't have screen names. I don't have any of this open-ended profile text. What I do have, however, are the closed-ended responses over here on the right side of the profile, including everything from racial background to educational attainment, religious affiliation, to also body type, whether you have or like pets or children. What are your drug habits? What are your drinking habits? And a variety of other attribute data. On this website, you can also search for other individuals on the basis of these criteria. And if you find someone you like, you can send them a message using the site's internal email system. So what we have here are the two basic building blocks of any network data set: individual data on one hand, relational data on the other. The individual data I analyzed are all users who were single, straight, living in the United States, and claimed they were looking for dating as opposed to a platonic relationship or just casual sex. I wanted to, insofar as we can differentiate the two, focus specifically on romantic, non-exclusively sexual relationships. The limitation to self-identified straight users is important to mention. This comes from the sad fact that most of what we know about mate choice to date is again, based on analyses of marriage records. So we know a lot about heterosexual pairing, not so much about whether same-sex pairing, whether or how same-sex pairing is different. So it seemed reasonable to me to begin by comparing apples to apples. I also look at users who joined between October 1st and November 30th, 2010. The reason for this time boundary basically is because if I didn't impose a boundary on who joins when, if I saw one user contact another on October 1st, it would be unclear whether this is the initiation of a new exchange or the continuation of exchange that began before my data window. So I focus on relatively new users to this site. This culminates in a final study population here of about 165,000 users. And the relational data I use consists of all views, profile views among this population during that interval, all people who initiate contact with someone after first viewing their profile, and all responses to those initiation messages, and nothing beyond that. It's actually challenging to interpret any interactions beyond that, because after the first volley of message and response, if two people stop communicating, well, is that because one or the other lost interest? Is it because they, someone said, hey, I'm interested in you, the other person said, great, here's my phone number. They went on to have a happy life together, but a life that was not contained in these data, right? So I really focus on these three types of states of a relationship, rather. I tend not to like data visualization of any sort at the scale because it produces the phenomenon known as the network blob. It tells you absolutely nothing about what's going on. But I think it's a little bit illustrative just to get a sense for the nature of these data and their scale. So just for kicks, I honed in on the population of users from Chicago, is zip code 60XXX. Right here. So just about 4% or so of the data. But we can see, again, the total network, the network blob, right, of views, some subset of which actually reach out and express interest, and some subset of those ties actually reply. And we'll come back to some more aggregate statistics about this population and what you're seeing in a moment. The method I use, remember, we're dealing with the literature that is largely, though not exclusively, descriptive, right? We're interested in capturing patterns. So I was interested in a method that was as simple as possible and also commensurable with prior work on both social networks as well as the mate choice literature. So Bodnowski and Korten provide this great review article recently in Social Networks about different possible measures of homogeneity and segregation in networks. The most straightforward is just the odds ratio. We can implement that using a fancy technique I like called ergoms. In the case of these models, however, it just basically amounts to logistic regression. And what we're interested in is the differential likelihood of forming a tie with someone based on whether you share a characteristic in common or whether you don't, right? Where we can define that characteristic as just about anything under the sun. In order to get some estimate of the precision of these parameter estimates, you can use two-way cluster robust standard errors, right, to account for the fact of correlation among senders, correlation among receivers, right, in this data set. And I can use those standard errors. On the other hand, it's important to keep in mind it's unclear whether these are necessary in the first place, given A, the data are so large in scale, the standard errors are often very small, and also we're, by some definitions, dealing with population-level data in descriptive analyses, and so whether or not inference is a meaningful term in the first place is questionable. So we can bracket that for a moment, and it's something I'd be thrilled to chat with others about. So finally, let's get into the fun part, the actual findings here. So I want to begin with, again, just something of a descriptive overview of these data. Now, in this online dating site, as with any heterosexual population, there's basically two possible ways an interaction can get going. You can have men who view a profile, reach out, contact, and then the woman replies, right? Or you can have women doing the looking, doing the initiation, and then waiting for the male replies. Two patterns here. You can see immediately, probably the less obvious one is that women are actually more selective than men. So they're less likely to reach out given that they look, and they're less likely to reply given that they've been contacted. Corollary of this touches back in my favorite argument with my single female friends is like, look, if you reach out, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting a response versus sitting around and waiting for the male to reach out first as a 1 in 5 chance of response, right? On the other hand, this greater selectivity on the part of women is basically overwhelmed by the greater volume of activity among men. And so we see much more viewing, much more contacting, such that at the end of the day, about twice as many mutual exchanges began by the male reaching out in the first place. This is where we start to get to the fundamental questions I'm interested in. And what you're seeing here is an overview of the patterns of homogeneity in this data set across 4 different dimensions: race, income, education, and religion, and at 3 different stages: views, initiations, and replies. So what we can imagine is if I had just a traditional data set of interactions, here's the degree of homogeneity at each of these given steps, right? Where homogeneity, again, is defined as sending a tie, however that tie is defined, to someone with an identical background. Same racial category, same income bracket, same educational attainment level, same religious affiliation, right? And perhaps predictably, we see a general increase in homogeneity the deeper you get into interaction. And at the end of the day, well, education is most important at the start, educational similarity, right? By the time you get to reciprocal exchanges, these exchanges are most homogeneous with respect to religion. And we see some other patterns throughout. So again, education starts out as important, but doesn't really get more important over time. I don't want you to focus too much on these numbers. I want you to keep this in mind as a baseline that we're beginning from. Again, the portrait of the aggregate levels of homogeneity in this network. Okay? Yeah?
How does the search process work? So if I'm on the site and I want to start with step 1,
Yeah.
am I directed to view certain people? Do I start by anchoring on friends of friends? What is the...
Fantastic question and important right off the bat, so I'm glad you asked it. How exactly do I go about each of these, right? The initiations and replies are relatively straightforward. Once you find someone, send them a message and they reply. This view stage can come about a few different ways on the site. About half of all profile views were generated as a consequence of the search function I described earlier. So you go put in the criteria you're interested in, the site feeds you back who meets those criteria, and then you click on their profile and look at it.
That's random within that, or is the site
Sure, not friend to friend, so we have no data on friendships, just data internal to the romantic ties. No, well, if you connected to Facebook or something, you could. And you can rank those results in any way you want, right? You can rank it by geographic proximity. You can rank it by, okay, I want the race important results to be most important. So I think those are the most direct actual expression of preferences, right? Because I'm typing in the search criteria and bringing up profiles. The site, of course, also interferes in some ways with this process, and this is an important question, again, off the bat, that I've chatted with a couple people today about. And I think OkCupid is advantageous precisely because of how matchmaking works. And basically, to the extent to which OkCupid is recommending matches elsewhere on the site, it's based on the preferences that you've volunteered. I can, again, describe that at greater length for anyone who's interested. But unlike some sites like Match Harmony, where there's the black box of how these matches are produced, basically, on OkCupid, it was founded by a bunch of math majors or whatever. So basically, you just go online, you answer a bunch of questions, right, about who you are, what you're looking for, and for each of those questions, how much it matters. And algorithmically, it pops back up a compatibility score between you and anyone else on the site. So to the extent to which the site is kind of recommending people to look at, you could argue that these recommendations are more or less endogenous. But we should keep that in mind, just of some variability in how these views are generated, as opposed to these other categories where basically it's tough to argue that the site's interfering, right? And so we should keep that in mind in interpreting results. Esther, and then...
And just another clarification about this. So before you click on person, you presumably see a photo if it's available and anything else, your compatibility score, and is there anything else you would see before you click on it?
Thank you also. So you get a small thumbnail of the photo, right? I believe you do see the compatibility score, and minimal, I think it's just kind of a random, bit from the rest of the profile, and that's what you're clicking on.
Not any of I guess race you could potentially tell from the
Race
photo.
you can infer, and so yeah, if how can I say people are interested in income if they don't see it on this little bit? And I would, in this case, assume that income was important in the search criteria they posted, or maybe it's correlated with something else. They did look for, or they told the algorithm earlier that I'm interested in someone who makes a lot of money like me, and that's a. But again, great clarification. Yeah.
So it seems like the assumption here is that the interaction or the possibility of interaction begins in the reply phase. But my understanding of OkCupid now, and I don't know if this was true in 2010, is that if you pay certain amounts, there's like different tiers. If you pay, you can see who viewed you. So there's the viewing stage and a unidirectional in terms of you view someone, you choose whether or not to initiate a conversation, and they can choose whether or not to reply. You might see if somebody views you, you might then view them,
Right.
so it makes it more likely to then initiate.
So when these data were collected, that feature was actually something you didn't have to pay for any longer. Although I should note that the A-list thing is what they used to call it in OkCupid. My understanding was that very few people gave the site money in the first place. But so you're absolutely right that another way that you could view someone in the first place is by seeing that they viewed you. And you click on that profile, right? So there are dynamics of reciprocity going on. That type of view actually is I think less than 5% of all views on the site. More common is looking at person A, and the site tells you, oh, if you're interested in person A, you might also be interested in these other people based on what person A is like, right? That's, maybe 20%, I believe, of views. So again, a variety of ways we can get to a view in the first place. Searching is the most common, which I think most directly speaks to my argument, right? But it's important to keep, bracket that in mind. And lastly, remember that going forward, I'm mostly presenting these numbers for the sake of comparison, right? Not because I think they necessarily provide some objective truth here. Yeah.
Since we're on the topic, just
Go.
the
No, go for
last
it.
question about views. Is this a site that maybe wants to, because you have first page, second page, third page,
Sure.
they're going to prioritize by ordering. Are they doing that based on, we want to show some newcomer that temporarily signed on, we're going to put them in the front page?
They claim they're not cooking the results in any such way, and in fact, you can voluntarily rank by who's newest on the site. You can say, look, maybe someone who's new is most likely to go out with me or something, right? But
Maybe that's an advantage. Then.
say again.
Maybe that's an advantage of using OkCupid.
I think so, and I think the context, which is all these questions are getting at, is important to keep in mind. This site is certainly not perfect for what we're doing, and online dating sites are often treated, as I'm kind of implicitly treating them here, as if this is some sort of open market where we can actually watch users' choices free of constraints. The site itself is a constraining factor. I do think, however, that OkCupid is basically the best we can get within this type of environment, right? I think the types of claims I'm making don't actually depend on a lot of these details, as you'll see. And finally, most other work on online dating you see these days don't even identify the site in the first place. So even this type of conversation isn't possible. So thrilled to chat more about this, and some of you have heard me rant at length about it in other venues by now. So anyway.
Just start with reading that equation. And one of the first graphs that he shows is this one of how women rate men's physical attractiveness,
right,
and how men rate women's physical attractiveness.
Right.
And so that made me think that, is there a rating of the other person's physical attractiveness in the site, and is that in some way used in the algorithms or not?
Not to my knowledge. So you're speaking of the book that Christian wrote, recently published, Dataclysm, about OkCupid and other big data sources like this. And he describes a finding where people are basically rating the attractiveness of men and women. The rating is not a uniform thing on the site. It's basically a specific subset of interactions you can actually rate someone. It's unclear whether that's attractiveness, general likability, or what. So I think he, in the book, relies too heavily on those numbers without appropriately contextualizing them. And in some sense, the fact that this guy has written an entire book analyzing the behavior of users of this site, you would hope would suggest that the site itself that these findings are minimally an artifact of the architecture. Otherwise, he's kind of writing a book about the algorithms he created, right? And as opposed to actual human behavior, which is what he, like I, am interested in. But my claims will be a little bit more tempered. So far, so good? Okay. Remember, important thing here is this is our baseline for comparison. So let's start to build on it in a few different ways. This is the exact same graph. I just made it smaller, right? What we can do as a first step, however, is hone in on just one of these dimensions, let's say race, and try and understand how this aggregate pattern is generated. Well, we can begin by decomposing it in two ways. First of all, we can assess the proportion of this pattern that's due to male-initiated activity versus female-initiated activity. And second, instead of looking at aggregate homogeneity, we can look at how much new homogeneity is added at each step, right? So a conditional approach rather than a cumulative one. So the relationship between the two is rather straightforward, right? We see that both men and women tend to view the profiles of racially similar people, producing the aggregate statistic up top. At that point, race actually diminishes in importance. So conditional on who they look at, men actually don't have any, or we don't see any increase in homogeneity at this stage based on who they reach out to. We see a little bit among women, right? But remember, more of the initiations are based on men, so this is weighted more, producing in the aggregate no increase in homogeneity. So we're seeing something of the, the slope, right, or the rate down here at the bottom. Finally, at the reply stage, both men and women care about homogeneity again, care about similarity again, and so we see an increase in racial homogeneity. This is just one attribute, again, with a relatively intuitive relationship between the two. But once we start disaggregating all four of them, we get some slightly different findings. So, for instance, we now see that income is the greatest increase in homogeneity that's added at this reply stage, especially for men replying to women. And where previously we saw that religious homogeneity was especially pronounced among reciprocal exchanges, well, actually, religious similarity doesn't seem to matter at all, right? Again, especially for men replying to women. So you see a very different ordering of these characteristics and a very different portrait of what's going on at each stage. So somewhat surprisingly to me, the ordering of each characteristic is actually the same for men and women at each stage, right? So they both consider the same attributes at views versus initiations versus replies. This is step 2. Also, don't get too fixated on these numbers because we're going to build up one step further. So far, we've been talking about patterns, about homogeneity, right? What we're actually interested in is disentangling preferences. So in this entire graph, I'm basically just going to focus on one data point, right? The strongest one over here. And this is the very strong tendency for women to view the profiles of men who share the identical educational attainment, right? I'm going to take this one point. I'm going to visualize it as a bar graph instead. This is the exact same data point, just have a bar graph now. And you can see exactly where this data point comes from. It's just a logistic regression where the outcome is whether or not you look at someone's profile, and the sole explanatory variable at this point is whether that person shares the same educational background, right? Let's start to unpack it a bit. So again, this is the size of the homophily coefficient. Let's add propinquity in there and control for whether two people are from the same first or second digit zip code, right? Whether everyone's in the 6-0 zip code or whether everyone is in a zip code that begins with just a 6. And of course, we see that often sharing the same zip code is synonymous with sharing a similar educational background. So our estimate of the importance of educational similarity per se drops just a bit. Do the same thing in a separate model where we factor in intersectionality, right? In other words, we throw in similarity on a bunch of other characteristics, whether you share the same body type, whether you share the same drug habits, whether you both want kids, whether you're both Aries, right? And we can re-estimate homophily as well. We can do the same thing controlling for differential sociality, right? The tendency for women from some educational backgrounds to view more or fewer profiles than others. And we can control for popularity, the tendency for some men to receive more or fewer profile views on the basis of their attainment. And of course, we can combine all of them to produce an estimate that I think is much more closely talking about actual homophily, the preference for similarity, net of these other mechanisms. And of course, we see about a 70% decrease, not of course, as you'll see in a moment, but we do see a 70% decrease in this case in the magnitude, our estimation of how important is homophily per se. A couple other minor things to draw your attention to is we see the greatest decrease in that coefficient in the intersectionality model. In other words, similarity on a few of these other characteristics is doing a lot of the work or correlated with similarity based on education. Although we see the best model fit in that second model, right? Because of course the biggest overall predictor of who looks at the profile of whom is going to be propinquity. Living in San Diego, you're probably not likely to be viewing profiles of people who live in New York. In general, right? So you'll focus locally. So let's put the pieces together. We just took this overall pattern of homogeneity, right, and disentangled the part of it that's actually due to homophily proper, right, the preference for similarity. We can replicate this process and run that same model for virtually any other data point on that original graph, including initiations and replies, including the other 3 characteristics, and also for men versus women. We can then compare this perspective, right, about homophily with the prior aggregate patterns of homogeneity. And in fact, we can go one step back further with the original graph we started with. Again, the most aggregated perspective, combining men and women, how much homogeneity is at each stage. And I could spend a lot of time just staring at the difference between these two graphs, but here is illustrating, right, the overall argument that I'm discussing here is you get a totally different portrait of what is important when. So originally, we thought educational similarity was super pronounced at the view stage, and it is. Education, homophily per se, however, is actually least important at that stage, right? And the ordering of the importance of other characteristics varies between men and women. Originally, we saw an increase in homogeneity according to income with each successive stage. Now, income is actually most important at the view stage, or very important among the view stage, especially among women looking at profiles of men. And it decreases to the point of heterophily at the reply stage. And racial similarity ranks somewhere in the middle in our overall aggregate perspective, whereas when we look actually at homophily, we see the racial homophily per se is actually most consequential, arguably across both men and women, and especially for men reaching out contact in the first place. Two caveats here. The first one is that just because a coefficient is negative or around 0, for instance, does not necessarily mean that an attribute is not important, right? It just means that homophily according to that attribute is not important. So maybe people are no longer matching on income, and in fact, the data show that they aren't. Well, this could be because people prefer others with higher income, right, or lower income relative to them. Regardless, we're no longer talking about homophily. We're talking about one of the other dynamics that these models control for. Second, as I suggested earlier, it's not always the case that we overestimated homophily in the previous approach. So while we saw that the coefficient for education drops once we add these additional controls, right, our estimation of the importance of income, for instance, increased. So a couple qualifications on interpreting those findings. I want to offer, oh yeah.
Just one quick question, clarification. So when you say control for intersectionality,
Right.
is it fair to say that that variable is capturing some other form of homophily that's not on the basis of the individual variables that you're talking about here? So what you're showing here is the net independent contributions of homophily of any independent individual predictor, but it's not telling us about necessarily about the overall level of, like if you were to think about homophily as one overarching concept, these data wouldn't necessarily tell us the overall degree to which similarity on any given characteristic, including being in Aries and all the other things that you
Sure. No, so it depends how you operationalize homophily, right? And I guess the approach I'm following here is the same as most of the literature, right? We say, look, there's this thing called homophily. We can decompose it on any number of dimensions. Maybe I care a lot about similarity with respect to gender, but not so much about similarity with respect to religious background, right? Whereas an alternative approach would be to come up with some metric of your overall similarity to someone else. And what I'm taking again is the former approach, where I say, yeah, look, we see this pattern of educational homogeneity. Part of it can be explained by the fact that education is also correlated with your views about children and so forth. Yeah, Braden?
This might be another way of restating what Nora just said, but could it be that what people really want is people are to be people who are similar to them culturally? So we're looking for, like Lauren Rivera would say, cultural fit.
Right.
All this demographic, visible, observable stuff is just a heuristic to help us to locate the people who are similar along these other dimensions. So when you control for intersectionality, it's not really surprising that those other factors really disappear in significance.
Certainly. And a lot of scholars in the work I'm somewhat critiquing here would not, I think, argue at all with this argument. Say, look, we've always known that education is you might call a badge, that symbolizes a bunch of other differences, and it's much more, in fact, efficient for me to just search for educational similarity. I don't actually care about your degree. What I care about is a bunch of other possibly cultural attributes with which that badge is correlated, right? I think there is a problem insofar as we forget that distinction and start talking about educational importance per se, right, or the importance, for instance, especially of race per se, when what's actually important in many cases are these other characteristics that are summarized by this global label. And I think this is what these findings start to tease apart on why exactly that label's important, and whether it is in the first place, right? In some cases, that label, income, maybe you're interested in the fact that more income is associated with a certain type of personality or lifestyle, or maybe you just want to be, have that really nice house to live in and a fancy car or whatever. So income per se really is doing the work. Yeah.
I know you've already said this, but I want to ask again. So when I'm on the site and I'm clicking on views, how much information do I have before I click on the profile?
So all you can see from our response earlier is just a little thumbnail photo, right? You can see, I believe, your match score, your compatibility score, and maybe just one little random snippet from the rest of the profile.
So
But
how is it measuring my choice of who I view? race homophily if I don't know anything about that?
I understand, that was the but part. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if how can I infer preferences, from views in the first place on characteristics you can't see? Well, again, especially in the case of searching, right? Even though this little thumbnail photo doesn't tell you much except perhaps race, I may know that everyone in the search result is making more than 100K a year because that's specifically what I searched for. So I agree, things get complicated.
Criteria that you're measuring here, basically.
That I'm most interested in that sense, whether that's because someone explicitly searched for something or whether the two attributes are correlated. And I think that conservative interpretation is more important. There's a question over here.
The photographs do say a lot. I mean, is it a good photograph or not? How the person is, what kind of clothing they are wearing, right? I mean, if you have, is it more explicit, the clothing that you are wearing or not? I mean, all of those things give you ideas about people's socioeconomic level and educational level. So I think you can see some of those factors just from the photograph.
Well taken, and appreciated. Yeah.
So one way to potentially deal with this concern, you said that 50% of the data on views are based just on the search criteria.
Uh-huh.
Does the data look different if you compare just that 50% to the remainder?
Don't know, because that statistic comes from someone else's data set, basically. And while I have data on who views the profile of whom, I don't actually know where these originated, which is a problem. And I would love to instead do that and focus solely on the search results, but unfortunately I can't. But a great possibility there. Yeah.
So if you have something like income and education, and you have the capacity to search for, say, income above a certain range or education above a certain range, which
Sure.
is the person's own range, given that both of those variables have a right skew, wouldn't you just think that it would induce some level of homophily just as a result of that being a feature of the search?
Explain exactly what you mean. So I follow you
Well,
with the
so
skew.
say income groups, which is an easy example, right?
Right.
So if you're searching for people who make about the same money as you or more,
Right.
right, and you just click randomly on people who make
I
the same,
see.
you're more likely to get people in your bin because there are more people in that bin to start out with, but it's not part of the normal crosstab because it comes out of the search.
Right, and this is particularly for variables, well, I think income is the best example, right, where you may be interested in similarity, you may be interested in someone's, what I would say, popularity, right, or someone with objectively high income, or you may be interested in someone's income relative to your own. Those types of precise intergroup dynamics, these don't tease out. And you're absolutely right. All I'm looking at is whether you're contacting someone in the exact same bracket. But again, I think what's important is that our impression of the importance of this similarity per se varies tremendously depending on how we approach the question. Also, by the way, if folks are interested, I have descriptives at the end of how the population breaks down in each of these bins. Most of them are who report income say they're less than 20K annual salary or so. So a lot of college students and such. So just some broader qualifications in addition to the ones we've discussed already, which I appreciate. Of course, I ignore here categorical variation, right? I'm just looking globally at racial similarity, right, as opposed to how much you observe, homophily among white users of the site, black users of the site, and so forth. We could, of course, assess each of these independently, and I've done this in other work with Andreas Wimmer. I felt like today's presentation was kind of complicated enough as we just talk about these blanket patterns, but that's important to recognize, especially the larger the category, right? Basically, the more that homophily among that category is going to bias these global impressions. I'm again, of course, looking at only one potentially unrepresentative dating site. We've already begun to talk a bit about how the site works, and I can comment additionally, if you like, on how its user population compares to the American population of internet using singles. And it's also important to qualify that, of course, relationships are not necessarily transactions, right? You don't necessarily wake up one morning in bed and say to your partner, hey, look, would you like to, cohabit? And they say, yes, great. And you move on to the next stage, right? Relationships develop organically in complex ways that this entire process may not exactly speak to. On the other hand, a number of romantic face-to-face dynamics do work this way. I said the third most common way that heterosexual couples meet is the internet these days. Second most common way is still in bars and clubs, where I think this transactional interaction is still accurately describes the situation. Hey, look, I'd like to buy you a drink. Can I get your number? Yes or no, right? This type of framework may be relevant for any other type of phenomena where you have basically a two-sided market, right? I look at which grad schools to apply to. I send them my application. They either pick me or they don't, and if they do, I choose whether or not to accept, right? So we can think about other scenarios that are they're similar in their nature. And finally, of course, given how common and how prevalent online dating is these days and how much it's impacting actual relationships, this is exactly the process that is characterizing how more and more couples meet. So to wrap things up, overall we began with this question of how is homogeneity generated, and we saw that actually most homogeneity in this data set comes up at the stage of profile views, right? The one stage that's a little bit more ambiguous on what turns up, but after that we see a decreasing amount of homophily over time. In general, the fundamental take-home again is that it's super problematic to infer preferences from the patterns, and we should not be treating relationships as expressions, but rather aggregations. And it turns out our results about the importance of homophily, right, about subjective social difference, about what this social structure looks like, vary tremendously based on what stage we look at, whether we consider that stage cumulatively or conditionally on the prior stage, whether we're talking about men or women in a heterosexual population, and even what other data are available, right? So I think what's also interesting is not so much the question I tried to address, but in the process what questions this raises, and that is, what does homophily mean in the first place? We can imagine that the very meaning of similarity, right, will depend tremendously on the specific characteristic, the stage of the relationship, the circumstances of the couple, and even the aims of the individual members. And so I think it's problematic that so much work is basically running around in entirely different circumstances and different relationships, but pretending we're studying the same thing, as if preferences are some stable, intercontextually consistent construct, right? And so I think much more fruitful is to ask ourselves, like, look, what are we actually measuring in any given context, and why does it matter? And again, I think Lauren's qualitative work is a great example of this, exploring cultural matching and what it means, why it's important in the context of hiring. Somebody have to tell her I keep singing her praise today, because I don't think she's here. In the broader strokes also, it's worth mentioning that the approach I've taken in this talk, to me, is relatively intuitive, and that's to take the subject of mate choice and employ the methodological and theoretical apparatus of network tools, right? This is surprisingly rare in practice. Often it's a data thing, that people who study marriages, these data just aren't equipped to, we can't use the types of tools we're accustomed to as network analysts. But there's an entire theoretical apparatus there that's available as well. Brian and co-authors documented this beautifully a couple years ago in their own annual review article about different network mechanisms, right, that give rise to relationships and extend these relationships over time. There's this tremendous gap between mate choice scholars on one hand and network scholars on the other. And I think it's time we close that gap. The third piece we need to bring into play is the fact that insofar as we're studying relationships, we're inherently studying process, right? Relationships of any kind don't just spring up out of nowhere, right? They arise based on the concrete actions and interactions on the part of individuals and couples. So too seldom, because our data are static, we forget that the social world doesn't actually work that way. So I think it's especially important, with the availability of these massive electronic data sources, this is a conversation I've already had today and have been having a lot lately, that we match this increasing size of the data, right, with increasingly deep theorizing in order to interpret what's going on. And I think I'll conclude with that point. Thank you.